attempting to do through the INA, because the INA did not happen in a vacuum. And this is a history that is important because sadly, after independence, much of the official history that has been handed down to us and continues to be the history we end up reading in our textbooks gives you the somewhat mistaken impression that India's freedom struggle was somehow uniquely peaceful. The non-violent movement did have a role, but the fact is that India's freedom struggle had another strain, which was just as important, some would argue more important, which was that of armed resistance against colonial occupation. And that story is not a new one. That armed resistance to colonial occupation goes back to the very beginning. It goes back to the resistance, for example, of the Marathas and the Sikhs against British incursions. After the British had well established themselves, it came in the form of repeated revolts. One of the very first ones, of course, was the one of 1857, but there were several others, including the ones by Birsa Munda, the tribal revolt. There was one by the Manipuri. Many often people forget that, in various far-flung parts of the country, there were continuous revolts going on. And of course, in the first half of the 20th century, the resistance of the revolutionaries. And this context is important because this is the story from which Netaji's story is connected. So you have to go back to the beginning of the 20th century, which is the time when Swami Vivekananda, but also another remarkable spiritual leader and thinker, Aurobindo Ghosh, were essentially trying to light the flames of national reawakening in India. And this is the context in which the revolutionary movement was born. Now, is it the case that the revolutionaries were attempting to sort of overthrow the British rule by the occasional act of assassination? Not at all. The revolutionaries knew, and they were quite realistic, that the occasional act of assassination or subversion and so on, while may cause some irritation to the British rulers, was not a serious threat to British Empire. So what were they really trying to do? And this is important because then you will understand what the INA was really about. What they were really doing, and you can read many of their writings, you will see, what they really wanted to do is to cause a revolt in the British Indian Army by undermining the loyalty of the Indian soldier to the British Crown. This was what they were all attempting to do. And the first really big effort happened, of course, in the pre-revolutionary period, when during the revolt of 1857-58. Of course, that was crushed, but it allowed a certain inspiration that remained alive. And this came into fruition in the first decade of the 20th century, when the likes of Sri Aurobindo, then known as Aurobindo Ghosh, and Vinayak Savarkar began to stoke up this idea. Both of these luminaries and freedom fighters were arrested circa 1909-1910. But the idea of sort of stoking up a big revolt in the Indian armed forces remained.